Reuters is an international news organization owned by Thomson Reuters. It employs around 2,500 journalists and 600 photojournalists in about 200 locations worldwide. Reuters is one of the largest news agencies in the world. The agency was established in London in 1851 by the German-born Paul Reuter. It was acquired by the Thomson Corporation in 2008 and now makes up the media division of Thomson Reuters. Paul Reuter worked at a book publishing firm in Berlin and was involved in distributing radical pamphlets at the beginning of the revolutions in 1848. These publications brought much attention to Reuter, who in 1850 developed a prototype news service in Aachen using homing pigeons and electric telegraphy from 1851 on, in order to transmit messages between Brussels and Aachen. In what today is Aachen's Reuters House, Reuter moved to London in 1851 and established a newswire agency at the London Royal Exchange. Headquartered in London, Reuters company initially covered commercial news, serving banks, brokerage houses, and business firms. The first newspaper client to subscribe was the London Morning Advertiser in 1858. And more began to subscribe soon after. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, the value of Reuters to newspapers lay not only in the financial news it provided but in its ability to be the first to report on stories of international importance. It was the first to report Abraham Lincoln's assassination in Europe, for instance, in 1865. In 1865, Reuter incorporated his private business under the name Reuters Telegram Company Limited. Reuter was appointed managing director of the company. In 1872, Reuters expanded into the Far East, followed by South America in 1874. Both expansions were made possible by advances in overland telegraphs and undersea cables. In 1878, Reuter retired as managing director, and was succeeded by his eldest son, Herbert de Reuter. In 1883, Reuters began transmitting messages electrically to London newspapers. Reuter's son Herbert de Reuter continued as general manager until his death by suicide in 1915. The company returned to private ownership in 1916. When all shares were purchased by Roderick Jones and Mark Napier, they renamed the company Reuters Limited, dropping the apostrophe. In 1923, Reuters began using radio to transmit news internationally, a pioneering act. In 1925, the Press Association of Great Britain acquired a majority interest in Reuters, and full ownership some years later. During the World Wars, The Guardian reported that Reuters came under pressure from the British government to serve national interests. In 1941, Reuters deflected the pressure by restructuring itself as a private company. In 1945, Reuters was the first broadcasting company to broadcast news of Heinrich Himmler's attempts to negotiate with the Western Allies through Count Bernadotte, a Swedish nobleman. The new owners formed the Reuters Trust in 1941. The PA sold half of Reuters to the Newspaper Proprietors Association, and co-ownership was expanded in 1947 to associations that represented daily newspapers in New Zealand and Australia. The Reuters Trust principles were put in place to maintain the company's independence. At that point, Reuters had become one of the world's major news agencies, supplying both text and images to newspapers, other news agencies, and radio and television broadcasters. Also at that point, it directly or through national news agencies provided service to most countries, reaching virtually all the world's leading newspapers and many thousands of smaller ones. According to Britannica, in 1961, Reuters scooped news of the erection of the Berlin Wall. Reuters was one of the first news agencies to transmit financial data over oceans via computers in the 1960s. In 1973, Reuters began making computer terminal displays of foreign exchange rates available to clients. In 1981, Reuters began supporting electronic transactions on its computer network and afterwards developed a number of electronic brokerage and trading services. Reuters was floated as a public company in 1984, when Reuters Trust was listed on the stock exchanges such as the London Stock Exchange and Nasdaq. Reuters later published the first story of the Berlin Wall being breached in 1989. Reuters' share price grew during the dot-com boom, then fell after the banking troubles in 2001. In 2002, Britannica wrote that most news throughout the world came from three major agencies: the Associated Press, Reuters, and Agence France Presse. Until 2008, the Reuters news agency formed part of an independent company, Reuters Group plc. Reuters merged with Thomson Corporation in Canada in 2008, forming Thomson Reuters. In 2009, Thomson Reuters withdrew from the LSE and the Nasdaq, instead listing its shares on the Toronto Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange. The last surviving member of the Reuters family founders, Marguerite, Baroness de Ruyter, died at age 96 on the 25th of January 2009.